I'm glad that James corrected himself earlier in the presentation, and he started to say, what great pressure, but then he changed it and said, but it's great opportunity. And clearly, that's what I feel. Maybe a little bit of pressure, but a great opportunity as well. But that's not what I'm here about tonight. What I'm doing here now is I'm the meat and the sandwich between some really important people that are going to talk to you, so I don't really want to take up very much time. It's a kind of complicated structure in that I'm going to introduce people, and we have to make sure that people stay on time because there's people that are having to leave afterwards. So I'm just going to do some very brief introductions. And it's kind of silly because you people know these people already, and so there's no really need to introduce them. But Mihaly Csiksentmihalyi is a professor at Claremont, a professor of psychology at Claremont. He's best known for flow and his work on optimal experience. That is how people experience deep enjoyment, creativity, and total environment, and how this experience can be activated and enhanced. It's resulted in a paradigm shift into the questions that we study and that we ask. Starting from his Ph.D. thesis in 1965 on artistic problems and solution, his work on flow and optimal experience moved into the 1980s, where he looked at developmental aspects and then moved into looking at how flow influences organizational settings. He set the stage for the development of the positive psychology, and it's fair to say that he's one of the co-founders and father of the movement. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce him.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, and I feel very humble and at the same time slightly proudly encouraged to have been to another World Congress of IPA, which has been so successful, at least until now. But I would like to, at this point, close with a few observations that, based on the past 15 years or so of the existence of our movement, if we want to call it that way. And I would like to start with the first slide. I don't have a clicker here. Maybe that will work? Yes. Okay, thank you. Let's see. Yeah. This, in a short way, this is the message I would like to leave today. It's a very simple message, but and I want to elaborate a little bit on it. First of all, the first 3 lines say that express a feeling that I have, which is that we have grown tremendously in 15 years, and we have accomplished a great amount. For instance, we have, perhaps the most important accomplishment has been that we have reintroduced into the discourse of psychology the neglected topics of human strengths, virtues, and therefore, we have, to a large extent, begun to change the complexion of the perspective of what human psychology is like. And I think that's a very important accomplishment. We have developed, most of you have developed coaching and counseling techniques based on this new paradigm. And again, that's a very, very important and useful accomplishment. We have, I think, to a certain extent, raised the hope of huge generation of psychologists and maybe the future, we have raised the hope that beyond homeostasis and the status quo, there is space and room for growth and improvement in the human condition as a whole. So these are huge accomplishments, and I don't want to belittle them at the slightest. They are great. But I think there are certain dangers also in having accomplished so much so quickly. There is the danger, for instance, of thinking that we have reached our goals and now we can relax, and all we have to do is keep applying what we have learned in this period, what we have achieved. And I think that would be a great pity if that was what is going to happen in the future, because I think there is a huge potential for positive psychology which we have barely touched yet. I don't think we must become complacent at this point, because public opinion and fads change very quickly, and usually because what at first seems like a magic solution turns out to be more difficult than what was expected. And if we promise great results too quickly, and we tell people that it will be easy to achieve, or that's what people think that we are saying, then I think that they will soon become disillusioned from what we are telling them. And they will start to consider positive psychology as another kind of half-baked, unsavory scam from which they should steer clear. So I don't think we should not rest on our laurels. And we should remember that any lasting improvement in the human condition requires hard work, time, and often requires hardship on our part. And currently, I think we are perhaps too much enamored of the hedonic view of what positive psychology should aim for. We are placing too much hope in the outcome of interventions aimed at improving positive affect, while almost very little attention is being paid to the institutions that provide the context for our lives. True, there has been advances made by positive psychology in studying the kind of proximal institutions that impact our well-being, such as families, schools, and the workplace. But the broader and in many ways more influential interventions of the social-cultural matrix have been largely ignored. Yet, economic inequalities, the modes of production, the planning of cities and neighborhoods, the planetary environment constitute the real interventions that shape our lives. We should not be content to imagine that writing gratitude letters or savoring a fine summer day compare in terms of long-term consequences for the well-being of humanity with the macro interventions represented by such things as climate change or the lack for social justice. So, in addition to the social conditions I think positive psychology should also pay more attention to not only to the institutions and the social conditions that shape our life, but also to the meanings and values and the worldview that gives direction and meaning to our lives. The scientific worldview has been very successful in the past couple of centuries in directing our hopes for the future, but it seems to me that that worldview that has been so successful on the technological, as a technological component of human evolution, appears to have reached its limits in providing a roadmap for the future. I will leave some of the considerations for the cultural aspect of the future to James, who will follow me. I will have to leave soon after this meeting to return to work tomorrow morning in California. But I would like to remind us that the second law of thermodynamics works not only at the physical, but also at the psychological level, which means that without inputs of energy from the outside, systems either dissolve into chaos or settle down into rigidity. And that's what physicists call entropy. And entropy is always at work destroying living systems and the sociocultural systems also to which they belong. So we are always facing the threat of entropy. On the one hand, social chaos, on the other, rigid stagnation. And these are the obstacles that we encounter in the road of human evolution. And the question is, how can positive psychology contribute in reversing these fundamental obstacles to human flourishing? Of course, you can't answer that question in the remaining 20 minutes or 10 minutes that I have, so I should just point out that one way is that to realize that evolution so far has been selecting increasingly complex systems for survival and for replication. Complexity, in the sense used by evolutionary biologists also, means that systems whose elements are more differentiated in structure and function, and also more integrated with each other to enable the system to survive in its environment, will be the ones that will be leading the continuity of the system to which they belong, the organism or the species to which they belong. And in terms of human systems, if they are only differentiated, which means individualistic, but they are not integrated, there is conflict, dissent, and chaos in the social fabric. When the system is integrated only but not differentiated, society becomes excessively conformist and stagnant. A complex society, on the other hand, rewards individual initiative and is open to change while being held together by trust and common purpose. Using this perspective, I would say that positive psychology has been focusing mainly on the differentiation axis of evolution and has paid relatively little attention to the equally important integrative axis. So, at my school, for instance, at Claremont, we have been trying to understand well-being from the perspective of this evolution of complexity and explore the relationship between what Marty Seligman has called the second and the third pillars of positive psychology, namely how enduring personal traits like happiness and life satisfaction on the one hand are related to the macro level variables of society like wealth, global warming, trust in the social system on the other. For instance, just 2 months ago, my colleague Dr. G. Nakamura has organized at Claremont a very successful international conference that brought together environmental psychologists and positive psychologists to lay the groundwork for a fruitful collaboration between these two approaches to improve the quality of life. We hope that seeds will bring fruit in the years to come, and positive psychology will turn out to be a firm supporter of environmental issues, and which in the long run will become a very important intervention in our lives. In a very different way, I would like to show briefly some of the research that has resulted from a research study that we did with Daniel Gruner, who is one of our students here, and which echoes in some respects one of the talks yesterday evening by Jonathan Haidt. And this is a study based on the same database that Jonathan talked about yesterday, namely the World Values Survey and also the World Bank. Has collected this data. We haven't collected the data, we have analyzed it. Daniel has analyzed it with the latest kind of statistical methods that are kind of reveal certain relationship between the macro level and the individual level. This, for instance, is map of some of the leading countries in the world in terms of the relationship between the vertical axis is the trust that people have in their, both in their social institutions like the politics, the educational system, the neighborhood, and the personal system of the people they live with and they are around. That's on the vertical axis. The horizontal axis is the income inequality, which would be 0 if everybody had the same income. And of course, that doesn't exist. But the deviation from that equality are on the horizontal axis. So you see that there is a almost perfect correlation between how much people trust have both in the institutions of society and in their neighbors in terms of how well the resources, financial resources, are distributed in the society. So these are based on N of 82,000 people aggregated by countries, by nationality. So this is one beginning to explore the relationship between the macro and the level and the individual level, which I think we need to keep an eye on in some ways. This is another way of representing the relationship, which is based on multiple regression, where you are looking at the outcome being social trust, and the question is what accounts, what explains variation in social trust mostly. And at the, yeah, this thing doesn't seem to work. Okay, so the bottom contributor mediator is income inequality, which I just mentioned briefly before. To the left is the per capita gross domestic product of the country in which you live. The happiness is based on the surveys done by the World Value Survey and which uses the kind of questions about happiness that have been developed over time by social scientists. And you see that there are two, as you know perhaps by how these representations work, numbers in parentheses show the direct effects of the variables to the left on social trust. And the ones not in parentheses are the mediated effect. And you see that, for instance, gross national product, the amount of money created in the society, has a very significant relation to trust when you look at it by itself. But if you take into account happiness and inequality, happiness being very positively related and inequality being negatively, the gross domestic product per capita doesn't explain social trust anymore. The contribution is 0.03. In other words, by itself, unless you take into account happiness and social equality, it doesn't create trust. So this is one way of looking at it. Now here, it's a more complex structural equation model where we look at what explains on the right hand the satisfaction with life. That right hand corner is satisfaction with life. Here we are using 35,000 individuals whose records have been collected again by this is the European Social Survey done in 2012. And you see that here we have the social trust, which we talked about before, is upper left. The income, here now we are talking about personal income, that is how much actual money the individual had, rather than the gross domestic product, so the income. Above the PA, that's positive affect. Bottom NA is negative affect. And then to the right, it's satisfaction with life. And again, what you see here is once you take into account trust, positive affect and negative affect, the income predicts very little. It's 0.08 is the prediction of income, individual income on satisfaction with life. Negative affect, of course, produces less satisfaction with life, positive affect more, and the trust in your social environment is as important as positive affect. So these are issues that we cannot really avoid taking into account if we want to understand how to improve either satisfaction with life or positive affect or happiness, because they are there in the background of our lives, and they are the things that when we wake up in the morning we worry about, and we worry about before going to sleep, are these macro level things very often. This is again as the same structure equation modeling, but at the bottom you see the correlations and how subjective well-being is correlated, 0.9 with negative affect, 0.7 essentially with positive affect, and 0.8 with trust. And so your well-being depends on the ability to feel secure in a social system that's trustworthy, with neighbors that you can trust, which provides you with a feeling of well-being and happiness. And when you have those conditions, it's much easier to accept the message that we are trying to communicate to them, namely that life is good and it's worth living, and that you have a voice in it and you can shape it. So these are the issues that we have been looking at, and it has been, obviously, it's just one possible way of conceptualizing this relationship between macro and individual level forces that impinge on our well-being, that shape our well-being. And there is so much more to do, and I hope that we are going to do more of it in the future. So what I would like to finish up with is to express my hope that in the future, positive psychology will not shy away from issues such as environmental degradation, social trust or mistrust, economic inequality, just because we are not ourselves biologists, sociologists, or economists. It would be much easier to just continue focus on individual hedonic well-being, but in my opinion, that would be shirking our ultimate responsibility, which is not to be just a good professional psychologist, but to be a person that uses his or her professional skills for the common good, for directing the course of evolution towards a future where we would like to live and where our grandchildren will have to live, whether they like it or not. And this is the message that I would like to communicate, and my time is up, but I hope to see you at meetings in the future, and if anytime you are in Southern California, drop by our university and let us know you are there, and we can maybe meet if time permits. So Thank you for coming. It was a great meeting, and I hope you go home charged with ideas and energy. Okay?